Hi, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. And thank you to the wonderful organizers who worked so hard to put on this conference. I hope that I can teach you something you don't know yet or prompt you to research and learn more. But most of all, I hope I don't bore you and put you to sleep. Our wild horses are managed by both the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. Today, I'm going to speak exclusively about the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, because they manage the majority of our wild horses and burros, and because they pay the bills for the few that the Forest Service does manage, so the Forest Service takes their management policies and plans from BLM. The BLM makes the claim that there's an overpopulation with our nation's wild horses and burros. I'm going to show you how this myth has been manufactured through some creative relabeling of land areas and by cherry picking language and laws and regulations that have been twisted to fit a narrative that supports continued livestock grazing while vilifying our wild horses and burros. The first federal law to protect American native wild horses was passed because of a grassroots campaign that started a national movement in the 1950s. This was started by a woman named Velma Johnson, who many know as Wild Horse Annie. During the 1950s, Wild Horse Annie sought to get Congress to protect wild horses and burros from Mustangers, people who would cruelly round up our wild horses, mostly for commercial purposes. She became aware of the cruel manner in which these wild horses were gathered, trapped, and transported, and the fact that most of them were taken to slaughter. In her efforts to protect them, she was able to gain national attention through many articles and interviews in newspapers and magazines. She eventually found lawmakers who were willing to take on the cause to protect our wild horses from inhumane handling. As noted by the Associated Press on July 15, 1959, seldom has an issue touched such a responsive chord. Wild Horse Annie testified to Congress in support of the Wild Horse Annie Act in 1959. She said, "The fight for the Mustang has come a long way in the past few years. From a mere handful of 50 or so firm believers in his plight of survival, it's come to an awareness throughout the country of his desperate plight, resulting in a mighty plea on his behalf. And here we are, all of us, meeting this week at state capitals across the nation, and at this week-long conference, once again presenting a mighty plea to our lawmakers to stop the inhumane treatment and disappearance of our wild horses and burros." Wild Horse Annie's national campaign resulted in the passing of Public Law 86-234, the Wild Horse Annie Act, on September 8, 1959. This prohibited the use of motorized vehicles to hunt or gather wild horses on public lands, but it did not include language she had hoped to protect the horses and manage them on their lands. When BLM began to interpret the law and decide how they were going to manage the wild horses, Wild Horse Annie was not impressed, but rather worried. During communications over the management of a herd in Wyoming, she stated, "The BLM is confusing the term preserve with another term, permit to exist," going on to express her worry that BLM was presenting a pretty picture, but perhaps things were not so rosy. She said, "Although they issued a news release indicating that the Mustang will now receive help, I can see no evidence that this is their intention. They plan to select certain areas in which they will permit certain limited numbers of Mustangs to exist. There was no talk whatsoever of setting this land aside specifically for the use of the Mustang, nor is there any program to provide any form of protection for those few which are permitted to remain." This was in 1967, although it can still be applied despite a more powerful act being passed in 1971. Wild Horse Annie went on to do a nationwide youth campaign, which had thousands of letters and postcards going to lawmakers and the president. In response, once again to public outcry, and because wild horse populations were in such steep decline, Congress unanimously passed the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. Now the BLM had been directed to protect wild horses and burros on the lands where they were then in 1971. We need the tonic of wildness. President Richard Nixon quotes Thoreau on December 18, 1971, as he signed the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. He went on to say, during the past several months, many thousands of Americans, particularly children, have concurred in Thoreau's plea with an outpouring of concern for the preservation of wild horses and burros on our western ranges. I take special pleasure today, therefore, in signing strong new legislation to protect these noble animals. He went on to say, embodying the best judgment of both the Congress and the executive branch, it should do much to ensure that a continuing safe habitat for wild horses and burros on the public lands of the United States. It declares that all such animals shall be managed and protected, said President Nixon upon signing of the bill. The BLM was created in 1946 by combining two existing agencies, the General Land Office and the Grazing Service. Many wild horse advocates then and now wonder if these agencies, who were primarily tasked with settling wild lands and protecting the interests of livestock producers using public lands, were the right people for the job. The concern is that there was and is a big conflict of interest right at the base. The BLM manages a larger area of land than any other federal agency, 260 million acres, or about 1/8 of the United States. The mission of the BLM is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So after the passage of the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, referred to hereafter as the Act or the 1971 Act, the BLM was required to do studies of the habits and habitats of free-ranging horses and burros, permitting public land to be set aside for their use. In addition, the Act required that these horses and burros be protected as living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. The BLM was tasked with identification of the areas where free-roaming horses and burros were found. There was no specific amount of acreage set aside, and the Act required management plans to manage wild free-roaming horses and burros in a manner that's designed to achieve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance on the public land. Although wild horse ranges were principally for the protection of the horse, the land was required to be maintained for multiple use, meaning that these areas were not to be used exclusively for the management of wild horses and burros. The BLM was also permitted to close public land to livestock grazing to protect wild horse and burro habitats. So let's break that down to just those points that I'm speaking about, because I could do another speech entirely on the failure to uphold some of those mandates like protection, which has never happened, but rather transferred individuals abusing the horses to the government and their contractors, performing the very horrors Wild Horse Annie saw, which prompted her actions. Or I could speak about the vagueness in terms like thriving natural ecological balance, which without a clear legal definition, BLM has interpreted to mean enough forage for livestock producers, resulting in thousands of horses being removed. Instead, I'm going to focus on how relabeling, sales or transfers, and remapping have created the myth that there's a wild horse overpopulation problem. The myth was created by the way the BLM interpreted the law to create regulations that are now part of the Code of Federal Regulations that outline how the BLM will achieve the mandates first given them by the passing of the 1971 Act. BLM has changed the label of wild horse range to 4 different labels. Their herd area, herd management area, wild horse range, and complex. BLM was mandated to designate areas where wild horses were on the range in 1971. At first, the wording was simply the range. Wild horse ranges, per the wording in the law, were to be managed principally for wild horses and burros. This upset a lot of livestock producers, mostly those public lands grazing permittees who raised cattle or sheep very cheaply on public lands. They felt this principal use would severely limit their livestock numbers permitted to be out there. So BLM began a semantic game and started relabeling areas. The BLM report to Congress in 1974 gave statistics for 1973. They admitted the number of livestock grazing in the 10 western states where wild horses live at that time was over 5.5 million animals. The wild horse population was estimated to be 60,000. However, we know that by this time there'd been a massive effort before the bill and right after the passing to remove as many horses as possible so less land and less animals would be considered federally protected. This means the claim of our wild horses rapidly disappearing from 2 to 3 million in 1900 to approximately 60,000 by the time of the first census in 1973 certainly should have prompted a unanimous bill to protect them. Additionally, in the 1986 publication in the Federal Registry, BLM made the following admission in regards to amending the Act. Several comments urged that the authorized officer be required to address the numbers of horses and burros that existed in herd areas in 1971 as a basis for further management. This suggestion is not adopted in the final rulemaking. There is no indication in the Act or its legislative history that herds should be managed at their 1971 size or any other specific level. Furthermore, although estimates of 1971 population levels have been made, they are at best conjectural and highly unreliable. It's more appropriate to allow the authorized officer the flexibility to determine appropriate management levels based on analysis of competing land uses, forage availability, and public concern. BLM has routinely claimed that the National Appropriate Management Level, or AML, comes from the number of horses that were on the land when the Act was passed in 1971. So managing the herds for approximately 27,000 horses, which is based on what BLM claims was the census in 1971, is a lie. Additionally, why would we ever want to again see a decline in the population to a number that prompted Congress to be so alarmed that they unanimously passed an act to protect them? Before I go further, let me explain that I refer to U.S. Code, or USC. The USC is made up of the official federal statutes of the United States and contains 53 titles. It includes laws or statutes passed by Congress. And I refer to the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. The CFR contains all of the regulations promulgated by executive agencies. In the context of wild horse and burro law, the CFR Title 43 contains the regulations put in place by BLM that put statutes, or the 1971 Act, from the USC into administrative practice. Regulations in the CFR can change every year, so it's important to stay updated with the most recent version. Regulations can also be worded differently than their corresponding statute in the U.S. Code, since they are BLM's practical implementation of the statutes. As BLM interpreted the act and began changing the labels in the CFR, the BLM began calling these areas where wild horses were herd areas instead of range, naming just a few of these areas ranges with a capital R. They are the Pryor Mountains Wild Horse Range in Montana, the Little Book Cliffs Wild Horse Range in Colorado, the Nevada Wild Horse Range in Nevada, and the Marietta Wild Burro Range, also in Nevada. By 1978, the ranges were named, although without any congressional authority, to split up the range as defined in the USC. BLM established 209 other areas, labeling them herd areas. Originally, and to this day, according to the USC, range is defined as the amount of land necessary to sustain an existing herd or herds of wild, free-roaming horses and burros, which does not exceed their known territorial limits and which is devoted principally, but not necessarily exclusively, to their welfare in keeping with the multiple use management concept for the public lands. This is the only definition that existed for any acreage where wild horses and burros lived or were managed when the act to protect them on those lands was passed until 1986. There was no range with a capital R, no herd area or herd management area, despite BLM having changed labels already in 1978. In December of 1984, BLM announced plans to amend the CFR, defining how they were going to meet the mandates of the 1971 Act. These changes were finalized and published in the Federal Register in March of 1986. Several comments from the public about these amendments were received, which objected to a specific subsection saying that numerous wild horse and burro ranges will be established on public lands. People were worried that there'd be too many ranges that would be managed principally for horses. So at this point, 1986, the BLM changed the range to range with a capital R officially. This put the minds of livestock grazers at ease because BLM was making official this label with no intention of creating any further ranges to be managed principally for the federally protected animals. To this day, no new ranges have been added. BLM also created another label calling some acreage herd area and herd management area, HAs or HMAs. And when the final decision was published in the Federal Register in 1986, the BLM had included a definition for herd area, replacing range as the general definition of acreage to be used. These changes were unconstitutional, going against the original intent of the 1971 Act. BLM now defined herd area as the geographic area identified as having been used by a herd as its habitat in 1971. Very similar to the definition for range that we read. Then to break up the large HAs, the BLM developed and officially defined two more labels. These are herd management areas or HMAs and ranges with a capital R, which are defined under the management area section of the regulations in the CFR, differently than the definition which still exists in the USC. The definition in the CFR for HMA says, the authorized officer shall establish herd management areas for the maintenance and management of wild horse and burro herds. In delineating each herd management area, the officer shall consider the appropriate management level for the herd, the habitat requirements of the animals, and the relationships with other uses of the public lands. BLM states on their website, today the BLM manages wild horses in subsets of these herd areas, known as herd management areas. When did Congress authorize managing the animals on these smaller HMAs instead of the entire herd range or herd area? And ranges were officially defined in 1986 as well, which read, herd management areas may also be designated by the authorized officer as wild horse or burro ranges to be managed principally, but not necessarily exclusively, for wild horse or burro herds. BLM had to create this entry for ranges in the regulations to appear to still be in compliance with the Act. But notice that the definition for a range to be designated is based on an HMA, not the larger area now called an HA. Again, where was the legal authority to diminish the lands the Act had stated were to be used for management of these animals? BLM was not acting to carry out the mandate that was intended, but it was now clear that they were intent on twisting and turning the law to attempt to appease livestock grazers. So this is where BLM changed the original mandate to manage all wild horse areas, principally for wild horses or burros, to only ranges had to be managed principally for them, despite already managing this way starting in 1978. In the publication in the Federal Register in 1986, when the new regulations were finalized, 43 CFR was amended in the final rulemaking to require that populations be self-sustaining and that populations of horses and burros be kept in balance with other uses, as well as the productive capacity of the habitat. Again, note the wording in balance with all other uses, not principal use. Despite BLM receiving several comments urging that the language on forage allocation in the existing regulations be retained, because horses or burros had principal use, right? Other comments stated that the word comparably was vague and should be replaced by equivalent. In describing how wild horses and burros will be considered in relation to other resources in formulating land use plans. This request was generous in that commenters were willing to change principal use to equivalent use. However, BLM shirked giving any such verbal limitations by stating specific provision for forage allocations not necessary, because the policy is clearly stated that wild horse and burro management will maintain self-sustaining populations. This cannot be done without adequate forage. The word comparably is used in the existing regulations to require all resource values to be considered in proportion to their presence on the land, competition with other resources, and the interest of the public in them, assigning equal or equivalent weight to all resources, as some comments suggested, would not allow varying circumstances to be treated appropriately. So BLM has at this point done away with principal use in all but 4 areas. They reduced that to comparable use with other resources like other wildlife and livestock. But what happens after that gets even worse. Excuse me. BLM started using Federal Land Policy Management Act, or FLPMA, to justify multiple use decisions, which included livestock grazing. So even though the CFR allows for closure to livestock grazing, stating if necessary to provide habitat for wild horses or burros, to implement herd management actions, or to protect wild horses or burros from disease, harassment, or injury, the authorized officer may close appropriate areas of public lands to grazing use by all or a particular kind of livestock. BLM in almost every case will reduce the number of horses allowed instead of reducing the number of livestock. BLM claims that FLPMA mandated them to manage public lands for multiple uses. Therefore, they cannot manage these areas principally for wild horses, but rather must consider them comparably. However, BLM ignores the line in FLPMA that says the policies of this act shall become effective only as specific statutory authority for their implementation is enacted by this act or by subsequent legislation, and shall then be construed as supplemental to and not in derogation of the purposes for which public lands are administered under other provisions of law. The 1971 Act was a land use policy already in existence, which was upheld in Mountain States v. Hodel, where the judge ruled that in structure and purpose, the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act is nothing more than a land use regulation enacted by Congress to ensure the survival of a particular species of wildlife. Therefore, FLPMA does not apply to areas managed for wild horses and burros as it relates to multiple use versus principal use. BLM, through relabeling and ignoring inconvenient parts of the law, has managed to continually decrease the acreage used to manage wild horses and burros. In February of 2009, U.S. Representatives Nick Rahal, a Democrat from West Virginia, and Raul Grijalva, a Democrat from Arizona, introduced H.R. 1018, the Restore Our American Mustangs Act. The act, if passed, would have amended the 1971 Act to increase available acreage for wild horses, develop additional sanctuaries. The language said it would forbid the killing of healthy animals and allow greater public participation in herd management decisions. The bill passed the House on July 17, 2009, with a vote of 239 for and 185 against, but died in the Senate after being referred to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So the first areas designated after the 1971 bill passed totaled 53,444,499 acres. By 2005, BLM was reporting that HAs were totaling approximately 53.3 million acres. However, the 201 areas where horses were actually managed, now called HMAs, had an acreage of roughly 34.4 million acres. By 2009, BLM reported that there were 339 herd areas with 51.2 million acres and only 180 HMAs with an acreage of 31.8 million acres. Now in 2022, they managed 26.9 million acres for wild horses and burros in 177 herd management areas, according to their statistics. And the specific acreage is impossible to verify or differentiate between HA and HMA in some instances. Sometimes state and private or even fenced out areas are all included in the acreage. So the national pasture has gone from 53.4 million acres to 26.9 million acres, according to BLM statements on the surface. This is a loss of about half their original lands, which is bad enough, but to add injury to insult, if one researches a bit more, you find out that the acreage reported as 26.9 million acres cannot be verified using the BLM web pages and documents. I stated on the surface, because as you dig deeper, you find more inconsistencies. For example, BLM recently put the herd area and herd management area statistics as of March 1st, 2021 out. And the total acreage they claim is managed just for HAs is 42.3 million acres. However, if you add the HAs by state that are managed currently for horses and burros, you get 22.7 million acres. And the total BLM acres for HMAs is 26.9 million acres. The big differences in the HA acreage is because BLM lists in separate tables for each state that the BLM acreage no longer being managed for HAs, which totals 19.6 acres. If you add the two figures, you get 44.4 million acres, which is closer to the 42.3 million they claim. And this is all from the same document published by BLM. So after the relabeling of lands and improper use of multiple use over principal use, the BLM then performed two more twists that have taken more land from the wild horses and burros. They now have and are still creating complexes. They'll take several HMAs, normally four to six of them, and create a complex to be managed as one area. Then they start lowering the appropriate management level or population size allowed for each HMA. Eventually, they zero out one or two of the HMAs. This means they remove all animals and no longer manage those acres for them. This decreases the acreage of the complex, however. Complexes are often listed with the acreage of all the original HMAs, but don't reflect the acreage removed when the HMA is zeroed out. The second twist I mentioned earlier in regard to loss of acreage for wild horse and burro habitat is that BLM has sold and transferred lands where horses were. This happens most often in sales or transfers to state land trusts. I first came across this during a case in 2018 for the Muddy Creek HMA in Utah. In this specific instance, portions of a wild horse area were sold to Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, or SITLA. This created a checkerboard area of federal public lands and state lands. Then when wild horses or burros moved from an area of public lands onto state lands, they were considered off the HMA. SITLA then sued BLM to remove horses from these SITLA lands. So BLM agreed to gather and remove them. In another sale to SITLA, BLM stated they were selling lands with the wild horses to the state. And because the only way to keep the horses off the area would be to construct a fence, which was not feasible, that HMA, Blonde Wash, was zeroed out for horses. What part of the act gave them the authority to sell or transfer lands where the wild horses are? Lands that are supposed to be managed principally for wild horses or burros? Again, adding insult to injury, BLM continued to use the acreage for Blonde Wash in the totals when including it as an HMA in the Bible Springs complex. They do claim zero horses, but use the acreage anyway. However, when BLM put out a plan to gather animals in the complex, the chart stated the acreage is 222,929 acres. This included 62,787 acres that no longer exist for Blonde Wash. If the Blonde Wash acreage was taken out, that would be a total of 160,142 acres. But the acreage they list in the last column is 152,000 acres, 152,563 acres, because each of the other three HMAs remaining have also been reduced in size. It's also important to note that all the Utah HMA web pages give totals for the larger HAs, even though the page is for the HMA, giving the appearance that more acreage is actually used for the animals. The real acreage in these complexes is often unknown. and the acreage will vary between different websites and documents. For instance, BLM information on the complex web page for the Antelope Complex states the Antelope Complex has 4 herd management areas, which encompasses over 1,608,350 acres of public land. I added each HMA listed individually. I included private and state acreage along with federal land for each HMA and came up with only 1,338,315 acres. In trying to establish what figures are accurate, I found the 218 Wells Wild Horse Resource Management Plan, or RMP, amendment, which is a document that outlines not only wild horse management for that area, but would also contain plans for all other uses of that area, like livestock grazing, extraction activities, recreation, etc. This amendment is the most current version of the RMP. And when I added up the acreage for the 4 HMAs in this document, I got a total of 1,183,340 acres. So the complex is either 1.2, 1.3, or 1.6 million acres. We don't know. Further frustrating my attempt at finding out exactly how many acres are really managed for wild horses was the fact that BLM states they manage 26.9 million acres of public lands for wild horses and burros. But when listing acres on individual web pages for the HMAs, they include acres that are not public lands. Some is state, some is public, and some simply has no horses on it for any measurable time, or was just zeroed out but still left listed. For example, BLM listed one entire HMA, the Ash Meadows HMA, with a total of 115,143 acres. However, the area is only managed for one horse because of the incidental use of horses migrating through the area. While we're very happy that BLM acknowledges horses migrate and that they're allowing this area to be used for the occasional migration of horses, it's not really an HMA with a herd being managed on it. Therefore, inclusion of the acres in the total really makes it appear that more land is being managed for herds than there really are. Further clouding the finding of the actual number of acres that wild horses can live on is the fact that the acreage for HMAs listed by the BLM will not reflect the actual acreage utilized by wild horses, because almost every single HMA listed also includes cattle. This means that the acreage listed for any given area is not actual. Additionally, with cattle comes fences that keep them from parts of the HMAs that they're already being limited to. So originally we had a big box, the range. Then we had a relabeling of that box to an HA, with the exception of the 4 boxes that they called ranges. Then FLPMA came into existence, and multiple use mandates were used to make a small circle in the HA box. That circle is labeled an HMA. And still, even that HMA has to be shared with livestock and other grazing wildlife. Then BLM, combining several HMAs, makes a new area, labels it a complex. Why not just use the original HAs then? Because creating the HMAs allowed them to map out natural water sources and prime grazing lands that were between those HMAs. I'll discuss that more later. Because there's currently no way to determine the actual acreage with all the different numbers in BLM's various documents, plans, and websites, the next best way to see how much of a share the horses would get to determine forage and water allocations. In order to do this, you'd have to research each individual HMA, and this is found in the land use plans, LUPs, or resource management plans, RMPs, for that area. The LUP or RMP will also give the amount of forage allocated to other wildlife and to livestock. I find that most HMAs allow the horses approximately 1/4 of the forage allocation. The BLM will typically give at least half to livestock, then the rest is split between wild horses and burros and other grazing wildlife. Using the proportion for forage allotted, you can apply the same proportion to attempt and determine the land BLM manages them on. For instance, if an HMA is 300 acres, the typical forage allocations are 150,000 acres to livestock, 75,000 to deer, elk, bighorn sheep, or antelope, other grazing wildlife, and 75,000 to the wild horses. Obviously, this isn't an exact calculation because of variables like not every acre would have forage, some acres have much less, other wildlife, etc. Given different variables that do exist, you might see a larger allocation given to livestock, but rarely would you see an increase for wild horses no matter what the circumstances. This method certainly isn't foolproof, but often tells the truth much clearer than the web pages of BLM do. BLM is required to be transparent, but the transparency thus far has proven that BLM numbers cannot be relied upon to be accurate. Now, in my attempt to use the BLM individual HMA pages to prove the claim that BLM manages 26.9 million acres for wild horses and burros, I could not verify anything. I often had to try and search for other documents or web pages because some pages gave partial information or unclear information. I found that some things that make transparency of actual acreage are impossible to discern. These problems included, but aren't limited to, information that's unclear or partial, necessitating the use of other sites or documents, different documents for a specific HMA, such as the RMP, LUPs, or even environmental assessments often showed different acreage for that HMA. All of Utah's websites for HMAs give the acreage for HAs. BLM includes acreage that's not public land, but is private land or state lands, without specifying how much of each is in each area. Some HMAs are in more than one state and are listed in each state they're in, which could lead to adding the total acreage of that HMA twice. Complexes are listed with a total acreage, and each individual HMA is still listed, which again could lead to adding all of these acres twice. BLM in one instance also listed the area around the HMAs of a complex, which was almost the total acreage of the HMAs added together, thus trying to double the acreage, when in fact the areas outside HMAs are not being managed for wild horses and burros. One HMA shows that wild horses were only allowed to be on grazing allotment in the HMA, further decreasing the acreage actually used to manage that herd, but yet listing the entire HMA. Now that HMA is the Tobin Range HMA, where BLM listed 2 allotments or livestock pastures where the horses are allowed to be, but no acreage for those areas is listed. And if you look up the allotments and try to find out, you'll see that only a portion of those allotments are on the HMA. So now discerning how much of the allotment could be used by the horses is as impossible as finding out how much of the HMA they can actually use. What is the truth in that entry is that wild horses and burros are often not managed on the acreage BLM states just because it's the acreage given for the area, whatever it's labeled. The horses are almost always fenced into smaller areas on the original lands. They're often fenced out of water. This was done when the original areas were reduced to HMAs. The lines drawn on the maps were drawn to exclude areas of natural water or prime grazing lands for livestock. For instance, the Palomino Buttes HMA boundaries and the Warm Springs HMA boundaries in Oregon are only a few miles apart. I believe that was 3. It's likely this and many other herds in Oregon were all one herd at one time. But through mapping boundaries, the BLM has created small pockets of horses in the least desirable areas. In the case of the Palomino Buttes and Warm Springs HMA, what's in the area between the two that's been excluded for wild horse use? As shown by the little blue area, water is what was mapped out of the HMAs. This drawing of lines on a map very often is to avoid the law. The 1971 Act is a land management plan. Therefore, it comes with water rights. Thus far, all water rights have gone firstly to livestock, mining, etc., not the horses and burros. If you look at the BLM maps for each state, you see how the HAs often touch one another. The way to deal with the idea of big areas of land being used principally for wild horses or burros was to draw them on a map as if they were somehow different herds. Then create HMAs that were smaller and maybe separate those if there's any good water for livestock in between, mapping the wild horses out. Then when they can no longer reduce the area on the map, they just start fencing. All this is continued because BLM uses FLPMA to support whatever narrative they want. For example, we know that they use the multiple use mandate in FLPMA to claim cows can be on wild horse lands. But when wild horses were eliminated from areas in the Ely district in Nevada, an advocate asked why the secretary did not notify Congress when a resource, the wild horses, was eliminated per FLPMA mandates. The response from BLM was to define principal or major use, which according to FLPMA states that it includes and is limited to domestic livestock grazing, fish and wildlife, development and utilization, mineral exploration, and production, rights of way, outdoor recreation, timber production. BLM went on to erroneously state that the statute doesn't apply to wild horses because the definition doesn't say wild horses, ignoring the legal determinations in several court cases that establish our wild horses as wildlife. Mountain States v. Hodel is one such case where the judge ruled that wild horses and burros are no less wild animals than our grizzly bears. This is just one example of how BLM will use a law such as FLPMA to manage for multiple uses, but then turn around and say that that very law doesn't apply to wild horses. This letter was also just one example of the bias BLM holds against our horses. And by using semantics, relabeling areas, selling and transferring lands, and by mapping out and fencing off water or forage originally used by the herds, the BLM has effectively created an illusion that wild horses are overpopulated. This overpopulation claim has been coupled with terms like overgrazing and now drought. Because BLM's mission is the same as it was when they were grazing service, they continue to protect those who use our public lands to graze their livestock. The overgrazing is blamed on wild horses when there's one horse for each 10 cows in these areas. Any damage, including to habitats for critical or endangered species, is very often blamed first on wild horses causing their removal. Adversely, there's never been a case where livestock were removed and wild horses were not. There's never been a wild horse area that was closed to livestock due to drought or lack of forage, so the horses could remain. This is accepted because of the wording used to make it palatable. Wording matters, and for the wild horses, BLM has added words like control to the original mandate to protect and manage. This was seen in the 1986 amendments. The 1986 amendments, where word changed the meanings, made it seem the original intent of the act was different. Some of those changes are seen comparing the USC language to the CFR language. A few examples are where wording in the act in the USC said the secretary is authorized and directed to protect and manage wild free roaming horses and burros as components of public lands. Protect and manage. But the BLM wording in the CFR says the purpose of these regulations is to implement the laws relating to the protection, management, and control of wild horses and burros under the administration of the Bureau of Land Management. It may seem like a small issue, but when you believe the BLM needs to control something, it gives the impression that there's some problem that needs to be managed. BLM used that word to imply that populations need to be controlled, when in fact they really wanted to control where the horses were allowed to be, and were making these areas smaller, while also giving themselves a twisted interpretation of FLPMA to apply multiple use versus principal use mandates. The natural ecological balance of all wildlife became balanced with other uses and productive capacity. Removing wildlife, but again, mentioning multiple other uses. The addition of productive capacity meant profit-making uses of the land. Instead of receiving principal use, they're now considered comparably, at least in regulations, although land use plans typically show them receiving less than comparable rations of forage and water allocations. And despite BLM being told by their own geneticist that a herd needs to be at least 150 horses to be genetically healthy or self-sustaining, almost no herd is that large. Herds have mostly been reduced to populations that in no way can be self-sustaining, but BLM explains this away by saying they'll import horses from other areas when genetic studies indicate the need. The BLM is supposed to manage the horses with the goal of maintaining free roaming behavior. The National Academy of Science did a report evaluating the BLM wild horse and burro program, and stated in that report that they used the terms free ranging and semi-free ranging. This was much different than their idea of free roaming, to which the report said, although the 1971 legislation calls horses and burros in the Western United States free roaming, the committee chose to use the term free ranging to reflect the purposeful and spatially adaptive uses of the rangelands that the horses and burros inhabit. Such populations are allowed to use spatially extensive habitats in ways that increase access to forage, improve their physiological condition, and increase the probability of their own and their population's viability. Additionally, the report stated this was done to acknowledge that when fences or other constraints are placed on wild horse areas, this would make these horses semi-free ranging, given that there's still enough room for the animals to move freely over larger areas than typical farms or ranches. The practice of fencing them out of water only affects the horses, not other grazing wildlife who jump fences. And in fact, BLM authorizes water improvements for every other wildlife and domestic animal on public lands, but not for wild horses. These are just a few examples I pulled from public inspection documents I have. There are hundreds more. In these examples, the top two are pipelines, lines, and a tank to improve livestock areas. The third is for elk. And the last is a letter in which BLM responds to an advocate who offered to help haul water or build wells for horses. BLM tells them no and gives them their reasoning. We believe this is still the current policy or attitude of BLM, because in 2020, Utah BLM arrested 2 campers for providing water to wild horses and burros. They claim to carefully consider the amount of forage and water, but what they don't point out is that cattle are on the land for less than a year, and they don't clarify that this is always during the months when the snow's melting off the mountaintops and the spring plants are coming in and everything's nice and green. Cattle are left out until everything is dried up, dead, or consumed. But when the BLM wants to claim horses do more damage than livestock, they're very quick to point out that horses are there year-round and livestock are not. This constant perversion of the facts has painted a lopsided picture. BLM claims that artificial water sources habituate the wild horses to a specific area or water source, but when livestock producers put water out for their livestock, that's okay. However, We've watched over and over in every state, livestock get removed at the end of their permitted schedule during the hottest, driest months of the year. The livestock producers are no longer providing water in these troughs or tanks. They often illegally leave gates closed, which stops horses from roaming to find alternate water sources. So now, when we're into the dry season and the livestock producer just stops hauling water, where wild animals are acclimated to getting the water, advocates for the horses are not allowed to begin hauling. BLM would rather claim drought and remove the horses. Not only does making the area smaller and smaller present a problem for access to water, forage, and even each other for genetic health, but it also produces the illusion that the wild horses have overpopulated and are utilizing resources such as food and water at such great race that they're destroying the habitat, leaving nothing for other wildlife and livestock. So they have to be reduced. What we see when we look at the big picture and all of the twisting and deception that has happened over the past 51 years is that BLM drew a pasture boundary on a map, then kept making it smaller and smaller until they could finally scream overpopulation, when in fact the pasture's just gotten too small. BLM insists on managing for a number, and that number is supposed to be the number of horses that were on the land in 1971, when they admit the number was pure conjecture. If BLM is supposed to manage them on the lands where they were in 1971, then they need to repatriate at least 26.5 million acres to the program. If BLM wants to keep cows on herd areas, they need to follow the mandate in the law that gives wild horses and burros principal use. We want Congress to go back to that 1971 law. We want them to think about the intent of a law passed to protect and manage a fast disappearing integral part of our public lands. We want them to look at the changes in language, the relabeling of areas in order to remove them, the illegal sales of